this is kind of what I'm going to run through really. So I'll start in Icon Office with a DXF file, and then we'll have a look at transferring that file into Icon and looking at the different importing options available. I'll give a little bit of a history behind the DXF in Icon just to give it some context, and then we'll look at version 1.7 within Icon with a couple of DXF examples, and we'll be using points in the file, how to manage the layers, also the background image, and then we'll briefly look at exporting DXFs as well. So what I'll do is I'll come straight into Icon Office, where I do have a DXF loaded. It's this DXF here. I'll load it up now. This is just it's called US house design, and we'll go through it in a minute. It's a DXF format. With regard to Icon Office, Jacob did run a quite informative webinar about Icon Office that is available on the FTP as a video. So I'm not going to go into the nuts and bolts of using Icon Office too much. I just want to show you the file in an Office environment to give you an idea of the file that we're going to look at within Icon. So yeah, before I go any further, the idea behind DXF in Icon is that the plan that the surveyor or the site engineer receives can be taken straight to the field without the Office software, which is, it's a big time saver. There's less time spent messing around in the Office, maybe extracting layers or making the file smaller. To be able to do this with a field software, you need a competent field software that does have the power and the ability to handle these DXF files, which isn't easy because they are complex files with a lot of elements, and they can be quite large in size. So there has been a lot of work behind the scenes in Harebrook to get the DXF performance up to scratch. And as you know, Icon 1.7 is released in a couple of weeks, and hopefully after this 20 minutes you'll agree it is up to scratch by now. I suppose the first thing to remember with DXF files is they can be large. I mean, they are very comprehensive in terms of the information they contain. Very large files with thousands of elements can create or could create import issues within Icon. So, but for these really large files, there is an option within Icon Office called Clean for Field, and I'll go through that briefly. That's the only thing I really want to demonstrate here. So if I just inspect this DXF at the moment, you'll see that, I don't know if you can see this here on the screen, but this is 900 kilobytes now, and there is an option within Icon Office to pare this down slightly, to purge a few layers. And if I just display the output window at the bottom there, and then come into Data, and go to Clean for Field. So if I just click Yes here, you'll see in the output window there'll be a number of processes in terms of layers being purged. So I mean, in terms of what you can see in the screen, nothing's actually changed in terms of what is displayed. But if I just save that file now and then inspect the size again, it's been reduced by about 30%. So that is kind of handy for transfer and import purposes. Just to confirm, nothing has changed in terms of what's displayed. So you don't remove any functionality from the file. It's just a useful function that's in Icon Office. It kind of removes everything in the CAD file that isn't visible in the graphics, so you're not losing any kind of functionality at all. So that can be useful for certain processes. Now, just to show you the makeup of this particular DXF, there's 7 or 8 layers here after Clean for Field. So there will have been a few more layers, like unused layers, that have been removed as part of that purging process. What I'll do is I'll export all these layers turned on. But incidentally, if I did export this file to Icon with some turned off, then Icon would automatically import the file with the same layers turned off. So you can prepare how you'll view your data sort of even now in the Office. I mean, you could turn those layers on later, but that's the way they'd be imported. So you can kind of call that sort of active layer identification. What I'll do now is I'll export it to a USB stick. I do have a USB stick in my computer, and it's not currently formulated to have the Icon folder structure that you'd expect, or this data folder basically that you probably know by now. So what I'll do, if I press yes now, and that file will be created. And I think you might have seen this before. I think Jacob's ran through it. But on the left-hand side here, you can see the files that are active in the current project in Icon Office. And on the right-hand side, this is the folder that I can use to import data into Icon. So if I just click on US House and go Transfer, you see it's been deposited in this data folder in the USB stick. I close that, and now I'll come into icon. Okay, so this is icon 1.7 here. If I show you in the, you can see I've got a version of 1.7. It is a test version, but it does the job. And I'll create a new project now to import that data. So I go to reference data, and I'll select my removable disk. And here's the DXF, okay? So what I'll do is I'll click on this right-hand arrow here, and this will bring up my import options for this file. So the first is the units. Now, DXF drawings themselves have no assigned units. Now, it must be defined upon import. It only has values, number values for each distance. And so it's helpful to know how the drawing was produced in the first place by the designer, or what did the designer choose as drawing units. So although it's normally fairly clear upon import and viewing it in Icon if you did select the right units. I mean, I know that this one is in inches. Normally it's meters in my experience, but you kind of know once you brought it into Icon anyway. And the second field here is height options, which is new for 1.7. I suppose maybe you can't quite see what it reads because you have these truncated descriptions here. Now, if I tap and hold now, then I'll get a full display there. So that's worth knowing about. If you can't quite see what's displayed in the screen, if you tap and hold, you get this running text. So yeah, I mean, so this height options is new for 1.7, and so at this point it's worth pointing out that when a DXF file is produced, every point has an assigned height. So this means that even if it's created without a height by the designer, it's automatically assigned a height of 0 upon production. And in all previous versions of Icon, every DXF file created by a designer without height, which is quite often, was imported into Icon with a height of 0. So this created problems in certain situations. If you're staking DXF points out, which is probably the main reason for bringing in these points in the first place, then all staked points are stored in red or blue because they're not at a height of 0, so they don't match the DXF point for height. So a lot of people have said they just want to import the northing and easting coordinates, so that when they stake out their points, even if they're not at a 0 for height, they get the green tick mark. So this will be possible for 1.7, and if I just come into a table, here's a table which explains the difference between there's 3 different height import options. If I come back into here, we've got ignore null heights, use all heights, and do not use heights. So ignore null heights is the default option, and then you've got 2 further options. And this table explains it in a way that makes it a little bit clearer for you, I suppose. Across the top, you've got 2 different options. You've got points which do have a real height assigned to them upon import, and then points that just have this null height, this 0 that's default, that's applied as a default when the DXF is produced. So, yeah. So, I mean, some files might have a bit of both, but the default option is to ignore null height. So you can see how the point would be imported with either a real height in the first column or a null height in the final column. So for the final column, the null height is ignored, and a 2D point is imported. And if you're using ignore null heights, I mean, use all heights and do not use heights. They're quite self-explanatory, really. But ignore null heights is the default option, and I would imagine that most people would leave it at this. But the 3 options do give a lot more flexibility, and it negates this problem of DXF files being created with this height of 0, which doesn't really help the surveyor. And here's a line taken from the manual. So staked points with a 2D reference will appear as green, like this, and not as blue or red anymore. So that can be reassuring for the user. I come back to the import options now, and there's also this, so if I choose ignore null heights here, now block options, there are 3 import options for blocks, and before I talk about the differences between choosing the different options, we should probably look at what one is. So if you can see this on the screen now, this is a screenshot from Icon Office. Here's a block in the file here, so you can see this shape here, this thing. Often it's an additional piece of drawing detail, really. It's not always necessary for a surveyor or a setting out engineer, but it often provides context to a CAD file. So Here in the US house drawing is an example, this sink detail. It is assigned to a single coordinate or insertion point. You can see there the coordinates just written in the description there. And so this next table sums up the differences between the three options quite well. So the default is insertion point, which would give the drawing detail and context without importing too many points and lines. You can see there that is the insertion point that matches the reference coordinate in the CAD file. So ignore at the bottom there, that's the kind of the light version of DXF, and Explode is the heavy version. You can see Explode here, each individual element has been assigned a point and a line, which is possibly maybe overkill, but that was the default option for the first icon version. So I'd say that insertion points probably a more sensible selection. I should say that this ability to define how blocks are imported was added to version 1.5, but version 1.7 now supports blocks within blocks, which is sometimes how CAD files are created. The final option here is which layers to import. So now if you know the content of a DXF file, this can be very useful. So maybe you only want to work with the drainage layer or the curb lines or whichever layer it is you want. It means you don't need to bring in a big file if you don't need to. I know I mentioned before this clean for field option in Icon Office, but this is kind of like a manual clean for field version essentially. You bring in exactly what you want, especially if it's a large file and you want to pare it down manually. So I'll import all the layers. I've got all the layers selected there. You'll see now that once the file is imported, there's another new feature for 1.7. I've got a message telling me exactly what I've imported. That wasn't there before, so that's good for assurance purposes in terms of points, lines, and surfaces. So before I actually look at how that's looking in Icon, I'll show you a brief DXF history in terms of the different ways that DXF's been handled within Icon. So in the past, a few people said it was difficult to handle DXF in Icon, so there's been a lot of work to improve it. And this US house version, this is how it is represented in version 1.3. So you can kind of see that this Explode way of importing blocks has probably manifested itself in this picture, but it's usable. You can see the points and lines, but it's difficult. It's difficult to know which points you're selecting and where. And yeah, in version 1. So I've got 3 screenshots here of various parts of this US house in 1.3. And in version 1.5, that was the biggest improvement really. There was text labels and the blocks were handled much better, and the layer management and identification was also improved. So DXF certainly became less of a problem at that stage, as you can see. But then I suppose you want to see how it looks in version 1.7 now. And so if I come into Stakeout, we can have a look now. So, the obvious thing you can see, there's a lot of, well, there's some color now that you didn't see before. It actually looks very similar to how you look at it in Icon Office or in an actual CAD software. So the main improvement is color, but there are other subtle changes that have been implemented. So, and bear in mind that this is with a purged file. So it's smaller, but without any key details removed, as is mentioned before. So when actually working in the field, ideally you want to have actual points available to stake out. And as you can see in this file and in Icon Office as well, there are no points to work with. It's just a layer and a line file essentially. So staking out lines is fine, but normally a setting out engineer is after a specific point, and that can be done here within the DXF with the show points option. So that's the default set to off, because that's how the initial CAD file is produced. Then if I set that to on, this generates points at all intersections, at ends of lines, all over the drawing, as you'll see in a minute. So you can see there at each intersection of the lines, and you've got these individual points. Now this is brilliant for a setting out engineer. It makes it very easy to pinpoint the specific position instead of using the line itself. So the initial display that you see is the same as in Icon Office or in any Office software. And then the show point options really, which is a feature of Icon, it is a feature. It turns a CAD drawing into a stakeout reference. So now let's say that I'm looking to work with a specific layer. I only want these brown walls here. You can see these brown lines here, nothing else. Now how do I turn the other layers off? Now, previously, I would have a look at the layers within the Map View Manager, and if I knew the name of a layer I wanted, then I would turn the others off. But a lot of the time, the setting out engineer doesn't actually know the layer names. He didn't make the file after all, so it might be guesswork. Maybe it's this layer, maybe it's that layer. You can imagine quite a lot of messing around before the correct configuration is found, really. So since version 1.5, there's been the option of adding code reference to the info panel, and I'll demonstrate the advantage of that now. So if I tap and hold in the info panel, and I'll configure, you can see pages 1 to 5 have already been configured with values. In page 5, I choose COD-REF here from the info panel. Now I'll select a point of a layer that I'm interested in. So I know I want a point from this brown layer. So if I tap this point, I'd like the point. And if I come through to page 5 of the info panel, it's identified that layer as layer 8. So I want that layer. I don't want any of the other layers turned on. So if I come back into the Map View Manager, simply select the All button here to turn off all the layers. And then I've got layer 8 down here. Accept. And you can see there that just got this single layer that I want to work with in the field, which makes it a lot easier to use as a real stakeout reference. So I mean, they don't need to bring the DXF into a PC beforehand to check it and turn layers on and off accordingly. You can do the whole thing in the field software. So, yeah, incidentally, to check the code of a line rather than a point, because I selected a point there, to check the code of a line, you'd need to begin measurements before this information is displayed. So the best way to get this layer information before connecting to a GPS or a total station is to turn show points to on and select a point that will be part of that particular layer, and then use the code reference in the info panel to identify that code. So yeah, that's the US House DXF, and I'm sure you can agree that it's a lot more manageable now as a DXF file. But what's also possible now, and has been possible since version 1.5, is to import DXF as a background image. I'm just going to switch projects for a minute here. So being able to import DXF as a background image is particularly useful if you only want a limited amount of active selectable data, but you still want a good idea or reference of the site content or orientation. So I've imported a different file this time to reference this. This is I've imported a setting out plan that's actually been used in England. Now, I haven't got the background turned on yet. I've got the control points just to show an example of where it might be useful. So those are control points for a particular file. And if I just turn on, you see background image here, I've got this DXF imported. So it's read-only, this background image. I can't actually select anything. But you can see with the control points turned on as well, and it's easy to select the control points themselves, there's nothing else active in the screen. But I know exactly where they are relative to everything else on site. So during setup, when I know that I'll only be working with those points, that's great. So, moreover, I can have this file available as a full DXF at the same time. So I've got it loaded as a background image here, but I've also got a DXF option here. See that? So let's say I'm only working with a particular layer in this DXF. So if I take the drop down here and I'll come to on, but I only want one particular layer. Let's say it's this drainage layer, and I'll show the points on that layer. I mean, previously, you can see now that this drainage layer, I've got the points displayed here. I know where these points are in relation to the whole plan now, whereas previously, if I just had that layer turned on, I'd just see those red lines. I wouldn't know, for example, that this point is just inside the wall like that. So it does give a lot extra context and orientation. So yeah, I mean, if I want to select this point, I'm given the option of a point and line. Incidentally, what's probably quite useful to know is that if it is only points that I'm working with, I'm currently in the stakeout application here, but if you do have the option of using layout points here, then that might be particularly useful if you're only working with points, because in the same scenario, if I do tap that point, it's immediately selected. It's not interested in the line, so it doesn't give me that multiple selection screen. Slightly quicker way of going around selecting points to stake out. Yeah, so the background image has been available from version 1.5 as well, and now it's in color as well. So yeah, there is That is a nice addition. One final thing I'd quickly like to show you is the Smart Zoom, which is a new feature for 1.7. Now that's tap and hold. If I, for example, load and I'm over here, instead of having to zoom in and drag the screen, etc., which is what you might have done in the past, if I tap and hold on zoom in, now I have this intelligent way of zooming into the to where I'm interested in. So let's say I'm interested over here, I can just click and it zooms into that specific area, which is a nice new feature for 1.7. So yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about file managing it within terms of importing in terms of DXF. I'll quickly touch upon exporting work done as a DXF as well. Quickly change projects again. So here's some work I've already done. You might recognize this. This is data from the volumes webinar we held a couple of weeks ago. And you'll see that each point here has a point ID, and I can also configure for height now. There's a viewing options here. If I want to display the height of each point, for example, then the height for each point is displayed as well. Or that could be the cut fill value or the code or whatever. So that's new for 1.7. But what I want to do is I want to export these points. So we'll come into export. I know it's this job, grade check, and that can be exported as a DXF as well. And I can define those units. I know it's meter, so that's how I'll export it. This could be opened in Icon Office, for example, once I've exported it, and the codes will generate individual layers, but the point IDs that you saw are not exported. So it's possible to extract coordinates from the DXF file, but the point IDs will be generated at that point, so they would not correspond to the point IDs that you saw in the original job. So if the point IDs are important, I suggest combining the DXF with a geo file in Icon Office, or otherwise a TXT or a CSV. And this requirement to export point IDs and point heights as a layer, it is slated for the next release. So come back to the slide now. To summarize, DXF handling has been a priority over the last two releases. Versions 1.5 and 1.7 have improved immeasurably the ability to use DXF. Previously, it was possible to work with a DXF if you knew the file already and what you were working with. But now the layer management and the improved line and text display, plus the addition of color and the ability to use a background image, does make it a great tool for anyone who wants to take a design straight from the architect and go into the field with it. And, you know, they all contribute to Icon being an excellent handler of DXF files now, so much so that the end user can confidently receive a file from the designer, take it straight to the field. You've seen the Smart Zoom as well and Clean for Field for Icon Office, and they're worth knowing about as well. So these also make working in the field that little bit easier.